Oh, it's you. Oh, you f***!
Having played the original Silent Hill 2 only a handful of times upon its release in 2001, and with just about enough stomach insanity to finish the game once over, I was more than curious then to see how Polish developer Bloober Team's 2024 remake stacked up in comparison. Known largely for the Layers of Fear games, a Blair Witch adaptation, and The Medium, all of which garnered review scores averaging out around 6 and 7 out of 10, it's fair to say then that the lead up to the remake's release has been somewhat cautionary for fans. 2022's reveal trailer hyped up pretty much everybody from the community. Hardly surprising when you consider the last mainline entry, Downpour, released well over a decade ago. With a fresh update for protagonist James Sunderland, familiar moments and gorgeous graphics to boot, I can remember feeling that this was going to be something special. But the combat trailer that followed around a year later had a lot of fans worried about the state of the game's gameplay, more specifically its animation design. But Bloober Team assured the fans that all would be well, as 8 months later, Silent Hill 2 Remake released to overall positive review scores that typically ran at around a 9 out of 10. Now that's quite an achievement, especially for a remake of such a beloved title. There's not a game out there that I've played that comes even close to the uniqueness of the original Silent Hill 2. This game has a very special place in my heart. The OG left more than a lasting impression on my 15-year-old self with its dreamlike, bleak and often oppressive atmosphere, as well as its deep and disturbing mature narrative. It was without a doubt the most depressing game I'd ever played, but in a good way. Does that make sense? It was one of the only games I played at the time that made me actually feel what the main character was going through. A mindfuck that took me straight to hell and back on multiple occasions and punished my psyche to the point that I just couldn't put myself through it all over again. It truly is a very powerful game and deserves to be considered one of the all-time greats in horror gaming. There's simply not another game like it. So could Bloober Team's remake then truly deliver on what made the original so popular and beloved to begin with? Does the remake give off the same vibes as the original? And does it do anything to level up what a lot of people consider to be the absolute peak of horror gaming? Starting my run on the evening of launch day then, with the lights dimmed down and a 3D audio headset in use for maximum terrifications, it took no time at all for me to feel that familiarity as one of the game's most famous moments began to play. James looks fantastic in the remake. While some physical features have slightly changed, as well as going from a softly spoken, gentle sounding man to a more dark and worn out portrayal, I immediately felt that this was still the James character. In actual fact, this James tops the original by quite a margin, and I'll explain why later. Certain remakes, namely from Capcom's Resident Evil library or even the recent Dead Space remake for example, have a good track record with updating its characters without pissing anyone off. But I'm sure I speak for many fans out there when I say that if just one thing feels off about a character you like, it is hard to capture the essence and foundation that made one fall in love with the original character to begin with. But so far, so good. The story begins just like the original, and the overall narrative remains largely faithful with a few new additional moments and tweaks here and there. Now, without giving anything away to those who've yet to play the game, James Sunderland receives a letter from his wife Mary, who passed away 3 years prior. She writes that she's waiting for him in Silent Hill, a once peaceful resort that has now become a ghost town with about as much life as Joe Biden. Along his journey, James meets a handful of sketchy characters with their own reasons for being in the town, as well as the freakish inhabitants that look like they came straight out of a goth fetish nightclub. James has to navigate through the streets of Silent Hill, as well as old apartment buildings, abandoned hospitals, and even a prison. Oh god, the prison. All in the hope that he will reunite with his wife, who he once believed to be dead.
Just put the gun to their head and Hi, James.
The narrative is filled with mature themes such as suicide and abuse, and the execution is often subtle, but at times obvious enough to understand underlying tones. I would advise the uninitiated not to go in expecting a Resident Evil-like adventure. This is very much a more bleak and thought-provoking experience, one that will most likely stay with you long after finishing the game. Making the long walk to the dreaded town took me about half an hour, and this is a game that truly deserves to be taken at a slower pace for me. Absorbing the atmosphere with each step I took and admiring the graphics along the way, I gradually began to feel uneasy the more I made my way in, remembering full well from the original that I was still safe, for now.
Oh my Christ almighty. Fuck off.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry. I was just...
Hey, it's okay. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
Yeah, I'm looking for Silent Hill. Is this the right way?
Yeah.
Reacquainting myself with Angela in the cemetery, I could clearly see, or rather hear, just how well these two characters were portrayed, and this stretches out towards the whole cast. The dialogue from the original remains largely the same in the remake, but it's great to hear these lines over 20 years later delivered with even more sophisticated acting. There are some moments and dialogue sequences from the OG that the remake doesn't quite reach, such as the scene with Maria in the prison cell, but overall, I felt the remake did an outstanding job with dialogue delivery. But one thing that stood out way more in the remake than anything else were the facial animations and body language within each cutscene, especially the former. Honest to God, I have never been so engaged watching fictional characters in a video game before. With the use of the Unreal 5 graphics engine, the subtleties and nuances depicted by simple things such as a raised eyebrow, a shrug of the shoulders, or even just a simple wince offer so much depth and characterization that even a scene with zero dialogue can still speak volumes. Revisiting Silent Hill 2's cutscenes in the remake was an absolute joy because of this. It allowed me to experience the same narrative and characters, but in a much different way. And so, certain scenes in the remake now hit much harder than they ever did before. This is undoubtedly the remake's biggest accomplishment in my humble opinions, and Bloober Team deserve full props for this. There's one particular moment that I've got to mention, and it's actually one of the newer scenes in the remake. Around a third into the game, when Maria and James have a conversation in the Heavens nightclub, there's a moment where James is tempted by a small alcoholic drink. He just looks at it, almost longingly. You can tell he's struggling inside. This was one of my favourite moments in the game's narrative, and a welcome addition in helping to further develop and humanise the James character. After a handful of hours of playtime, I started to understand what the remake was all about. Silent Hill 2 offers a familiar experience, but with some alterations and changes to justify itself within the series, and this doesn't just stretch to the aforementioned cutscenes. Puzzles in the remake have been recreated with more involving tasks and are undoubtedly an improvement from the OG. The dark room and coin puzzles in Woodside Apartments were two in particular that pleasantly tantalised my brains. These are some of the best puzzles I've experienced in a horror game for quite some time. They make you think, and they don't spell it all out for you, at least on medium difficulty, which is what I went with for both puzzle and combat scenarios. Delving deeper into the game, the Unreal graphics engine showcased more of its power with its incredible contrast and colour palettes. This is a very beautiful yet uncompromisingly dark game, The kind of dark game you have to play in a darkened room to save yourself the grief of light reflections from windows and lamps. Smart move, Bloober Team. I like it.
Oh, you fuck! Son of a bitch!
So with that being said, be prepared to wet yourself, guys. I'm being honest, this game fucked me up quite a bit. It's not the scariest game I've ever played, but it's a close contender. I can no longer look at shop floor mannequins the same way.
Shit! Fuck me! Jesus.
I can't tell you how many rooms I cleared SWAT style just so these fuckers didn't get the drop on me. And even then, these guys still managed to find the best hiding spots. You never really feel safe in Silent Hill 2, especially when you realise that you can quite literally walk right past certain enemies and not even notice. Disgusting. But again, in a very good way. There are only around 5 main enemy types in Silent Hill 2, with variations on most that offer a slightly different level of play, but what struck me as I ventured more and more into the game was just the sheer volume of enemies. There just seemed to be way too many of them. I became fatigued with the amount of melee combat in the game, especially considering how simple and repetitive the melee combat actually works, and constantly checking each enemy was dead with a few stomps to the solar plexus didn't help things either. However, what I later found out was that it's all to do with obtaining certain endings within the game, to which there are 8 in the remake as opposed to the OG 6. Fighting the majority of enemies is actually a choice you make that can quite literally decide your ending. You can in fact run past most of them, if you're brave enough of course. The combat consists of combining melee and dodging with firepower, but you'll be using your wooden plank or steel pipe a hell of a lot more if you want to conserve ammunition. I also found that health drinks and syringes are provided way too often in this game, at least on normal difficulty. They're that plentiful that by the time I finished my first playthrough, I still had more than enough drinks and all of my syringes that I'd collected. I didn't even die once on my first run. Okay, that one was a brag. But I did find myself using most of these health drinks during the later boss fights, so I was certainly glad I accumulated so many. But admittedly, this did take a lot of the pressure off my shoulders and somewhat negated some of the horror in the process. But again, in the game's defense, these health drinks are also somewhat tied to certain endings within the game. I just found myself being a little less afraid because of this.
Get me out of here, you brat!
In your dreams, fart face.
Please open the door. There's something in here.
Sure there is. A big lying fart face. See a fart face?
Laura! Laura!
Bosses have been given a significant makeover in the remake, and they are also way better than the original game, with most offering a slightly different way to approach them, rather than the majority of fights in the original which just had you shooting. My favourite boss was without question the Abstract Daddy. My heart felt like it was beating at 100 miles per hour during that one. It told the story so well that I actually felt what it could be like in that certain character's position. The noises behind you, the building collapsing all around you, it was done masterfully, and I'd never experienced anything quite like that before in gaming. One of my favourite bosses in recent memory. The game has a great tendency for making you feel on edge throughout most of the experience, just on the ambience and atmosphere alone. Thankfully, Bloober Team have kept a lot of the same music and ambience from the OG, albeit with some slight changes here and there. But unfortunately, and this is my personal preference here, as is the case with this whole entire review, a lot of these newer tracks don't quite land the same way as they did in the OG. I think the original Silent Hill 2 had a bit more soul to the soundtrack. Hill 2 Remake also benefits from great sound design, from squelching creatures in the distance to James exclaiming his fear and frustration as he squishes an enemy underfoot. While the odd graphical and gameplay hiccup presents itself now and again, there was actually a moment where I got stuck to a wall after battling an enemy and had to restart the process. What's even more frequent though are the dips in frame rates. Despite playing on performance mode, it can be a little distracting, but in all honesty, I did give it a bit of slack just because of how captivating the cutscenes were, but I can say that the in-game frame rates are a little better however. I decided to try out fidelity modes during my New Game Plus run, and honestly, I wouldn't recommend it. The change in graphical quality is quite small, and 30 frames per second just doesn't cut it after playing on performance. Stick to performance mode for the best experience. Having sunk around 28 hours into a single playthrough, I can tell you that Bloober Team have delivered a great remake. The game's biggest strengths happen to be what the original game was known for best, its story and atmosphere, and Bloober Team have made some great choices in including and expanding on some of these elements from the OG. Even though some tunes and dialogue don't quite hit the same way as the OG, I feel that the remake does a better job overall. But unfortunately, the combat does drag it down for me. Now don't get me wrong, it is satisfying at times, especially when enemies seem to stop popping up quite so often, or even when I found myself surrounded by a number of them at once in an enclosed area. It's just, whether I chose to fight or run, I can't help feeling that on potential further playthroughs, I'll choose to run past pretty much all enemies, and that's just not for me. Whenever I play a game for the very first time, I'm often thinking to myself, I wonder how enjoyable this will be on potential second or third playthroughs. As soon as I began running past all enemies and grabbing the most essential items, I quickly found that I'd become jaded by the time I entered the hospital. I still got scared here and there, absolutely, but this game was most effective on my first run, hands down. It engaged me with its superbly told narrative, and it had me clenching my ass cheeks throughout most of my journey. The only aspects of the gameplay that truly engaged me on a consistent level were the scares and the puzzle solving, but I also found that the game drags in places. It feels like it could have worked better by reducing the game time by a couple of hours or so. Sections like the labyrinth had me pining for the end of the game throughout most of my time there. And by the time I actually got to the final area, I couldn't help but feel that this would have been received far better had the game time been a little shorter. With all this being said then, Silent Hill 2 Remake gets an 8 out of 10 from me. This is Bloober Team's finest work to date in my opinion, and should be experienced by all horror enthusiasts. Let me know what you think of the Silent Hill 2 Remake. What did you enjoy the most out of it? What did the remake do better or less well than the original? Whatever your thoughts, sound off in the comments, and please like this video if you enjoyed it, and of course subscribe to EggOnBeansOnToast for more content like this. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.